Did you know that over 40.8 million people in the United States are living in poverty? And the situation is even more alarming when it comes to children. Nearly 21% of American kids are affected, far surpassing the global average of just 11.7%. In a country known for its wealth and opportunity, these numbers reveal a disturbing truth. Poverty remains a persistent and growing issue. In this video, we're diving into the top 10 poorest states in America where poverty is hitting hardest. Number 10. South Carolina. In South Carolina, the fight for financial stability has become increasingly difficult for many families. The cost of living continues to outpace wage growth, leaving many residents struggling to make ends meet. South Carolina's poverty rate of 16.6% and an unemployment rate of 5.2% as of 2024 highlight the depth of the state's economic challenges. While the state's population has reached 5.46 million, the average annual salary of $51,250 falls far short of covering basic needs for many residents. Housing costs in cities like Charleston have skyrocketed in recent years, pushing many families into rental properties they can barely afford. According to a report by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, renters in South Carolina must earn $21.54 per hour to afford a two-bedroom apartment at fair market rent, far above the state's average wage. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, nearly 40% of South Carolina's workforce is employed in low-wage occupations, where average hourly wages hover just above $11. This has created a widening gap between the state's wealthiest residents and those struggling to survive. 9. Tennessee. With its 7.1 million residents, the volunteer state faces its own economic challenges, with many families caught in a struggle against the high cost of living and stagnant wages. Despite having a relatively low unemployment rate of 4.1%, the state's poverty rate stands at 17%, reflecting the deep financial disparities between urban and rural areas. A 2022 report by the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development found that rural counties in the state experience poverty rates as high as 30%, nearly double the state average. While Tennessee's average salary of $53,030 is slightly higher than South Carolina's, it still falls short when it comes to providing economic stability for many households. In cities like Nashville, housing costs have surged in recent years, leaving families in search of affordable rental properties. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition reports that in Tennessee, the minimum wage needed to afford a two-bedroom apartment is $19.24 per hour, more than 3 times the state's minimum wage of $7.25. 8. Arkansas. The state, celebrated for its natural beauty and rich cultural heritage, faces significant economic challenges that leave many residents struggling to keep up with the rising cost of living. With a poverty rate of 17.7%, one of the highest in the nation, Arkansas is a state where financial instability is an everyday reality for far too many. The situation is even more dire for children, with a staggering 21.7% of the state's youth living in poverty. For the state's 3.07 million residents, these economic disparities are becoming increasingly difficult to overcome. At the core of Arkansas's economic struggles is a combination of stagnant wages and rising living costs. The average salary in Arkansas is just $48,250, well below the national average. This wage gap leaves families stretched thin, often forced to prioritize necessities like housing and groceries over savings or health care. Housing costs are a major source of stress for Arkansas residents. Rent prices have increased by 14% in the past year alone, outpacing wage growth and further deepening financial insecurity for many households. For families already living paycheck to paycheck, a single unexpected expense, like a car repair or medical bill, can push them into debt or force them to choose between paying rent or feeding their families. Grocery prices have also surged by nearly 10% in the past year, adding to the strain on household budgets. 7. Alabama. The state continues to face persistent poverty and economic hardship. The state's poverty rate stands at 18.6%, with nearly 1 in 5 residents living below the poverty line. While the state boasts a relatively low unemployment rate of 3.8%, much of its workforce is employed in low-wage jobs with little opportunity for advancement. This lack of economic mobility contributes to Alabama's entrenched poverty and financial instability. The average salary in Alabama is $50,400, just above the state's cost of living but barely outpacing inflation. This means that for many families, rising costs are outpacing wage growth, leading to financial insecurity. Housing, like in Arkansas, is a significant expense for many residents. In cities like Birmingham and Montgomery, rent prices have increased by more than 15% in the past 3 years, making it harder for families to find affordable homes. For those who rent, the struggle to pay for both housing and necessities like food and health care is a constant battle. Food insecurity is another major issue in Alabama, with 16% of the population, nearly 800,000 people, experiencing limited access to affordable and nutritious food. The rising costs of groceries, which have increased by 9% in the past year, add to the financial pressure on households that are already stretched thin. Many families are forced to make difficult choices between paying for essentials like medicine or cutting back on groceries. 6. Oklahomans. With its estimated population of 4.08 million, Oklahoma has long been a state that embodies the tension between economic opportunity and persistent hardship. Despite boasting a relatively low unemployment rate of 3.4%, the state's poverty rate stands at a staggering 18.9%, signaling a significant gap between job availability and livable wages. For many Oklahomans, the daily struggle is not finding work, but simply surviving on the wages they earn. The state's average salary of $51,450 is notably lower than in more economically robust regions, leaving families scraping by as they face the ever-growing cost of living. Housing costs, in particular, have risen sharply in recent years, outpacing wage growth and placing a massive strain on middle-class families. In cities like Oklahoma City and Tulsa, housing costs have risen 20% over the past 5 years, with the median home price reaching $150,000, a figure that many residents find increasingly difficult to afford. For renters, the picture is just as bleak, with average rents climbing steadily, forcing families to allocate a larger portion of their income to housing. 5. Kentucky. With an average salary of $52,030, Kentucky's workers are caught in a web of stagnation, with wages insufficient to cover rising living costs. The state's unemployment rate of 6.8% underscores the difficulties Kentuckians face in securing stable employment, particularly as traditional industries fade. The poverty rate in Kentucky is one of the highest in the nation, standing at a troubling 19%. This persistent economic struggle is compounded by the state's low minimum wage, which, at just $7.25 per hour, is one of the lowest in the country. For minimum wage workers, the reality is grim. A full-time job at this rate amounts to an annual income of just $15,080, far below the poverty line for a family of 4. Even with 2 full-time minimum wage earners, families still struggle to afford basic needs such as housing, food, and health care. Housing costs have risen steadily in Kentucky, with the average rent increasing by 4.8% in the past year alone. In cities like Louisville and Lexington, the median home price has surpassed $220,000, creating further challenges for families who earn significantly less than the state's average salary. The high cost of housing, combined with stagnant wages, leaves many families teetering on the brink of financial collapse. Grocery prices are another concern, with the average Kentuckian spending a significantly higher percentage of their income on food compared to residents in other states. Over the past year, grocery prices have surged by 7.5%, further stretching family budgets. 4. West Virginia. With a poverty rate of 19.8% and an unemployment rate of 4.2%, many West Virginians find themselves struggling to make ends meet, and the situation is growing dire. For families in this Appalachian state, The cost of living is a constant burden. Housing costs, though lower than the national average, still eat up a substantial portion of income, with many families paying nearly 30% of their earnings on rent or mortgage payments. This is especially challenging given the stagnation in wages. The average salary in West Virginia is just $52,200, far below the national average, making it difficult for families to keep up with rising costs in groceries, utilities, and health care. 3. New Mexico. New Mexico, with its high poverty rate of 20.1%, stands as one of the poorest states in the U.S. Despite a relatively low unemployment rate of 4.1%, many residents face a brutal reality. Wages are simply not enough to cover the basic cost of living. With a median household income of just $48,822, well below the national average, families in New Mexico are finding it harder than ever to make ends meet. The state's economic challenges are multifaceted. While the unemployment rate suggests that jobs are available, many of them pay less than $11 per hour, which is insufficient to cover rising costs in housing, groceries, and health care. The cost of living in New Mexico, especially in cities like Albuquerque and Santa Fe, has been steadily increasing, but wages have not kept pace. Families are forced to choose between necessities like food, rent, and health care, often resorting to debt to fill the gaps. 2. Mississippi. Despite its relatively low unemployment rate of 2.7%, the state faces deep systemic issues that have left many of its 2.94 million residents financially vulnerable. Mississippi boasts the highest child poverty rate in the country, with nearly 28% of children living below the federal poverty line as of 2024. This troubling statistic highlights the generational challenges many families in the state face, where economic mobility remains elusive. One of the main culprits of the financial strain in Mississippi is the high cost of living, particularly in housing and groceries. Housing costs, although relatively lower than national averages, are still a significant burden for many families. With a median household income of just $44,966, lowest in the nation, Mississippi families often struggle to afford basic living expenses. The stagnation of wages, particularly in rural areas, further compounds the issue. As the cost of groceries and other essential goods rises, many families find themselves caught in a cycle of debt, unable to save or invest in their future. Mississippi's overall poverty rate stands at 21%, a stark reminder of how systemic inequities and limited access to resources continue to perpetuate financial instability. With the state's average salary sitting at $47,570, workers often find themselves unable to cover both their immediate needs and plan for the future. Despite the state's efforts to boost education and workforce development, the financial barriers continue to keep many families from climbing out of poverty. 1. Louisiana. As of 2024, Louisiana's poverty rate remains among the highest in the nation, with an alarming 18.9% of the population living in poverty. Louisiana is home to 4.57 million residents, and its economic disparity is evident in the wide gap between the state's average salary of $53,440 and the lower earnings of many residents, where many workers earn closer to $52,306 annually. The high cost of living in Louisiana is one of the primary reasons families are struggling to make ends meet. Housing costs in cities like New Orleans have surged in recent years, making it difficult for low- and middle-income families to find affordable homes. Similarly, grocery bills have soared, leaving families with little room to cover other basic necessities. For many families in Louisiana, this economic stagnation means falling deeper into debt or remaining stuck in a cycle of poverty. Like Mississippi, Louisiana's economic struggles disproportionately affect children, with nearly 22% of the state's children living in poverty. Without significant changes to wages, housing policies, and access to education and health care, Louisiana's residents will continue to face challenges in improving their quality of life.